So the Sony 200-600mm telephoto lens, is it still a relevant option today? This is a question that I was recently asking, especially given that this lens was released in 2019, and here we're in 2024. I mean, a lot can happen in 5 years, and especially in the photography industry, and in this case it did. I mean, there's been a ton of E-mount glass that's been released, but in particular, there's two lenses that have been released by Sigma that I feel like are quite compelling. And that is the Sigma 150-600mm that was released in 2021, and then there's a Sigma 60-600mm that was released in 2023. Both of these lenses in some ways outperform the Sony. However, I feel like there's at least 5 areas that the Sony still continues to stand out. And so in this video, I want to get into some of those reasons, as well as look at some reasons why you may or may not want to consider the Sigma. So without further ado, let's get into it. So spoiler alert, as you can see, I ended up going with the Sony. But it wasn't before doing a bit of research, as well as renting it for 2 different trips. I rented this Sony for a trip to Kenya, where I spent over a month in the Masai Mara, specifically in the area of the Mara Triangle. I got to film and shoot images of the migrations, the wildebeests and the zebras crossing the Mara River, as well as, all the other big animals, the elephants, giraffes, lions, leopards, cheetahs, and just a ton of other amazing wildlife. And then I took this lens to Costa Rica, where I spent close to 3 weeks in the rainforest there, shooting all sorts of birds, hummingbirds, sloths, and various species of monkeys. And so between these 2 trips, I feel like I really got to run this lens through its paces and get a pretty good sense of the performance. But anyway, let's get into some specs on this lens. So this lens, as I've mentioned, is a 200-600mm. It's an f5.6 to f6.3 lens. It's an OSS lens, which means it's optically stabilized. And it's in Sony's G lens lineup. So if you are familiar with Sony's lenses, you have like your G Master, then your G lens, and then their other lenses. So the G lens gets a lot of the features that you tend to find on their G Masters, like the enhanced build quality, the weather sealing, and it has the assignable button on it. And then it also has a few other options on the lens. So you have the switch for the auto to manual focus, you have various focus limiter options, as well as different modes for your image stabilization. And this lens weighs in at, I believe, 2.1 kilos, so around 4.5 pounds. And it's an internal zoom lens, so that means it doesn't change length when you're changing your zoom. Now that we've gone over some of the specs of this lens, let's get into the reasons that I feel like this lens continues to stand out. Now the first area has to do with the build design, and in particular it's the internal zoom. And there's really 3 reasons that I feel like it's kind of a big deal. The first is it gives it much better weather sealing. And for me, I shoot this lens in some pretty harsh conditions, both the dusty conditions of safari to the rainforest where you can be exposed to precipitation and all kinds of humidity. So for me, that's really important. The Sigmas, on the other hand, have the extending telephoto zoom. And so when you extend your barrel and you're moving it in and out, you're moving air in and out of the lens. And so it's really just a matter of time before you're gonna get some dust inside your camera lens. Now, the other upside is you have a really short throw on your zoom. So you can go from 200 to 600 with like a quarter turn of the barrel. And that's pretty awesome, especially when you're trying to acquire a subject. You can come out, zoom it back to 200, find your subject, and then quickly move in and frame your subject at 600. The other big issue, or upside to the internal zoom, I should say, is that when you put it on a fluid head or a gimbal, it balances really well. Whereas if you have an extending barrel zoom, every time you change your focal length, you're effectively throwing it off of balance. But the second area that this lens continues to hold its own is where it comes to sharpness. Sure, this isn't a 600mm prime, but when compared to the Sigmas at 600mm, this lens tends to still come out on top. Now the other big area that this lens stands out has to do with its autofocus. It supports both the alpha 1 at 30 frames per second and the Alpha 9 Mark III at 120 frames per second at their maximum frames per second. The Sigmas, on the other hand, are limited to 15 frames per second, and unfortunately that looks like something that Sony imposes on third-party lenses. So it's kind of an unfair advantage, but it is what it is. The other thing is, right now that's not an issue for me. My camera bodies top out at 10 frames per second, but I just like to know that I have some future-proof built into this lens so that if I do upgrade my camera bodies, that won't be a limitation that will be a problem for me. Now, the other area that this lens continues to stand out is that it supports Sony teleconverters. It supports both the 1.4 and the 2.0 teleconverter. And the Sigmas, on the other hand, aren't supported by Sony teleconverters, and unfortunately Sigma doesn't have licensing from Sony to produce E-mount teleconverters. So just be aware that if you choose to go with the Sigma, a teleconverter probably isn't an option for you. And then the fifth area that this lens continues to stand out has to do with its price point. Yes, its MSRP is $2,000, so it's not like a cheap lens, but for this kind of lens type space, it's a really good price point, and it's really right in line there with the third-party lenses, and this is the first-party lens. So the 150-600mm from Sigma is priced at around $1,500. The Sigma 60-600mm is right at $2,000. But given that this lens has been out for 5 years, you can often find it on sale or used for a really good price point. In my case, I was able to get it several $100s off, and if I can go with the first party option with some of the advantages that the Sony has, I feel like it's a pretty good value. But now that we've gone over the pros of the Sony, what are some of the cons? Well, I find that there's really three. The first one is the optical image stabilization, and it's probably the bigger one. The Sony is rated for only 2 stops, where the Sigmas are ranging between 4 to 6 to 7 stops respectively. So definitely an advantage there. The next con for this lens really has to do with the focal ranges. This one only goes 200 to 600, where on the Sigma you can go 150 to 600, or with the 60 to 600 all the way out to 60 millimeters, which is really crazy for a telephoto lens. And then the third con has to do with the minimum focus distance. On this lens is 2.6 meters. Where on the Sigma 60 to 600 it's only 60 centimeters, so you can almost use it like a macro lens. So that's just something to be aware of. So now that we've looked at both the pros and the cons of the Sony, as well as kind of done some loose comparisons to the Sigma options, how do you make up your mind? Well, I can't make up your mind for you, but I just want to run you through my use scenarios and kind of how I ended up choosing the Sony. So naturally, we've talked about the features already, but I like to go on safari with 2 camera bodies, and I'm fortunate to have 2. So I'll usually put this 200 to 600 on one camera body, and then on the other one, I'll use a fast prime, something like my 135mm G Master that's an f1.8. And the nice thing about having that prime is I can often shoot at or near the base ISO of my camera body, as well as be able to handle challenging lighting conditions. It also is just blazing sharp, really good autofocus, and it gives you beautiful bokeh, fall off, and background separation. So pairing these 2 options together, I feel like kind of gives me the best of both worlds. But if you have only one camera body, I really think the Sigma 60 to 600mm is really compelling. I've been on safari where there's a male lion walking right near my vehicle, but at the same time there's some subjects, some elephants or something in the distance that I want to capture. But if you choose to go with the Sigma, just be aware of some of those limitations on the frames per second. You don't have the option to use a teleconverter. Also, I forgot to mention, but the Sigma 60 to 600 is like over 5 pounds, where the Sony's like 4.5. And then also the balancing of the lens. If those are big deals for you, just kind of keep that in mind. Either way, you're not going to go wrong. I mean, these are both great lenses. But what do you guys think? Do you think I made the right decision by going with the Sony? Are you going to go with the Sony, or are you going to go with the Sigma? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and what are some of the pros and cons that you found looking at these lenses? It's always interesting to see someone else's perspective, so I hope you found this useful. But anyway, I'll catch you guys later.